Yeah, so as Andy said, we're continuing our service on well-being this morning, specifically vocational well-being, or rather well-being in our work, whatever our work may be. So we're going to be looking at various different parts of Genesis 1 and 2 this morning. But I'll actually start by taking you to St. Ives, yes, St. Ives. I don't know if any of you have been here, if anyone recognise this beach. I spent quite a lot of time here growing up. We used to holiday here quite a bit. We used to swim in the sea and bodyboard as well. And there's actually quite a strong drift current in this sea at times, which means you can start in one place in the sea, and then actually, without realizing, the drift current can take you further down the beach. And there's rocks on either side, as you may be able to make out. So what this means is that when you're swimming in the sea or bodyboarding, whatever, you have to be continually looking back to the shore, continually realigning yourself with a point on the shore, perhaps your camp. Otherwise, you risk wandering off into the rocks without even realizing. And this is effectively the warning that the author of Hebrews gives in chapter 2 of his exhortation. Therefore, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. So what he's saying is that the world has various ways of thinking. It's not a world without currents. The world has a way it wants you to think about certain issues, and certainly that's the case for work. So it's important that as Christians, we keep realigning ourselves with the Bible. We keep realigning ourselves with His Word, keep studying it, keep meditating on it, lest we drift away from it, because we will drift away from it if we don't do that. So what I want to do this morning is to look at the Bible and make sure the Bible is what is defining our theology of work, our thinking of work. So if you turn in your Bibles to Genesis 1 and 2, see if you can get the page open. I won't be going through it verse by verse, but I'll just pick out a few important points that I think should define our theology of work today. So the first point is that work is a blessing. I can't really see that. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." Can you read that there? Is that okay? So we see that the world before the fall was very good. We know this from the end of this passage. But it still needed subduing. There was still work to do. We get an idea of what this might mean further down in these verses. God talks about giving man every plant yielding seed, and mentions every tree bearing seed in its fruit. And seeds, as you know, need planting and cultivating and harvesting. It's a lot of work that Adam was given to do in the garden. We also see that man's purpose in the garden was to work it and keep it. Woman was also involved in this as his helper. You see this from Genesis 2:15 and 18. So man had a lot of work to do in the garden even before the fall. Work was not something that came into the world because of the fall. So work is rather something good. It is a blessing, as we see in chapter 1, 28. But how is it good? How is it a blessing? Well, my argument is that God was the first worker. We are made in His image, and therefore we can actually know God better through our work. So first, God was the first worker. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, then it actually mentions that God worked 3 times in this passage. And if you recall Genesis 1, we actually get some very practical images about how God worked. He was separating light from darkness. He was separating waters from waters. It's not as though he just snapped his fingers and it all appeared. He was actually involved in the creation process with this very practical imagery. So we'll come back to this passage later, but for now, just that we know that God was the first worker. He is himself a worker. Secondly, we are made in his image. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea," and it goes on. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. So we could talk a lot about what it means to be made in God's image. There's a lot wrapped up in that concept. But in this passage, I think the focus is on the function of man's image, why we are made in God's image. And that's to have dominion over creation, to work it and keep it, as we've seen in chapter 2. So work is actually part of, wrapped up in how God created us, what it means to be human. God, our Creator, created us in his image for work. So finally, if work is part of who God is, and we are made in his image, then work is one of the ways in which God graciously reveals himself to us. So if you, I don't have much experience of this, but if you're talking to a baby who's a few months old, as we saw in that video there, if you try and communicate with it, or with him, you don't go over and say, "Hi, Theo, you enjoying the Euros? How are you getting on with that book that I lent you? It's good, right? Yeah, let me know what you think." No, that's not a way to communicate with a baby. You won't communicate with him on any meaningful way if you do that. What you've got to do, as Becky was doing in that video, you come down, you make yourself lower, and you communicate by making funny faces or smiling and waving. So this is what God is doing when he gives us work to do. He doesn't communicate to us the full extent of his majesty or glory, but rather he comes down to us and says, "I am the creator God who made all of this creation. I want you to work with me in subduing it." So work is one of the ways that God graciously reveals himself to us. And so from this we know that if we view work as simply a dull necessity, or perhaps we idealize a life without work, whether that be an early retirement or some political utopia without work, then this is actually a rebellion against God's created order, because it spurns one of the ways in which God graciously reveals himself to us. It spurns one of the ways that God shows us his grace. Now, this doesn't negate the hardship of work that was brought in by the fall, but it's similar to marriage or parenting in this regard. They are difficult, they are painful because of the fall, but that doesn't negate the fact that they are a blessing in themselves. So too with work. It's difficult and hard because of the fall, but it's still a blessing. Work is a blessing. Next, rest is a blessing. Going back to Genesis 2, we see that God actually rests twice. It says, he mentions he rests twice in this passage, after finishing the heavens and the earth. And I thought it was quite a funny thing to have God resting at the end of finishing his work. I thought that was a human thing that shouldn't be applied to God. But clearly, what is happening... Oh, sorry, I put it on the screen. Clearly, what's happening here is not that God is recovering from fatigue or anything like that, because the creator of the ends of the earth, he does not grow faint or weary, as Isaiah 40 reminds us. He who watches Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. So God is it's not a simple recovering from fatigue that's happening here. So what is happening? Well, it's not merely just a break from work either, although that is part of it. It's actually a holy rest, a blessed rest. Perhaps you could call it a Sabbath rest. And I think on this regard, Isaiah 66 parallels Genesis 2 very closely and sheds some light on this. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you will build for me, and what is the place of my rest? Sorry, Mum, can you pass me my water? Thank you. Thank you, Dad. Happy Father's Day, by the way. Thank you. That's better. So Isaiah 66 parallels Genesis 2 very closely. So we see heaven is identified as God's throne. The earth is identified as God's footstool. And both of these are identified as a place of God's rest. So in Genesis 2, the imagery is God finishing his throne, the heavens, finishing the earth, his footstool, and then resting on them. Psalm 132 goes even further, or gives us an even clearer image. And this is a psalm about David's desire, or starts with at least David's desire to build God a temple, a dwelling place. I'll not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. And then it goes on to connect three really important themes that we've touched upon that are relevant for the topic of rest. So it connects God's footstool, his earth, the creation, God's resting place, and also God's dwelling place, which I identified as his ark or temple or tabernacle. So it says, let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for here I have desired it. And that's clearly God speaking at the end. So, yes, this psalm connects God's footstool, God's resting place, and his dwelling place. And I don't know if you guys remember Dad, Alan Kwan's sermon on the temple in Ezra, but he looked at the language that's used for the temple and showed that it's actually God's shakan, the place where God's glory dwells. That is the language that's being invoked here. And it's actually the language that is being applied to Genesis 2, to God's place of rest, to God's footstool, to God's dwelling place. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to paraphrase Genesis 2 by saying, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and God's glory dwelt there. God's glory rested there. But this holy, blessed Sabbath rest is not just for God. Rather, through the death, the resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, we sinners can join with him in this Sabbath rest, as Hebrews points out. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest. Strive to enter God's rest. So we see that the Sabbath rest, this rest that God inaugurates in Genesis 2, and that is applied to us in the fourth commandment, this rest is actually eschatological. What I mean by that is that this rest points towards the day when we will rest with God forever, where we will dwell forever with him in his glory. So if you're not a Christian here, I would say that the promise of entering this rest does still stand, but it will not stand forever. We see that in Hebrews 3:11. So I would say to you, the warning from Hebrews, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And if you think you might have hardened your hearts to God's voice, to the message of God's word in his gospel, then ask God to soften your heart. Ask God to soften your heart to his voice that you might hear it. For those of us who are Christians, then in our new covenant context, God's this Sabbath rest that's commanded is what we're doing right now, gathering as God's covenant people to worship him together. And as Psalm 132 reminds us, when we do this, we are actually going in to God's dwelling place. We are actually worshipping at God's footstool. As Hebrews 4 reminds us, when we come together to worship, we are actually getting a little taste of what it will be like to rest with God forever, to dwell with him forever in his glory. So if you want good vocational well-being, then you must not neglect this Sabbath rest. Indeed, why would you want to? Why would you want to spurn that taste of eternal glory that we will enter into? And I would also say that physically gathering together to worship is an indispensable part of this. So if you can, then don't just be content to watch others do it online. Come worship at his footstool. Go to his dwelling place and worship together with us. Now, this Sabbath rest is essential to our vocational well-being, this work-rest cycle, not just breaking from work and playing golf on the weekends, so that's fine. This Sabbath rest is an important part of our vocational well-being. It's how we were created. And so finally, I would say on this point, if we want to better understand our Sabbath rest, if we want to know what the real theological meaning of what we're doing here today, then we need to understand our eschatology. That is, we need to understand our theology of the end times, because that is what our Sabbath rest points towards. And so that is why it's so important that we have a sermon series on the unseen, looking at issues of heaven and hell and the new creation and the difference between those two. It's important not just as a peripheral theological curiosity, but it's crucial to the Christian faith because it is what we are experiencing right now in miniature. So work is a blessing, rest is a blessing, and finally, work is a divine mandate. So, there we go. This passage on the left here, we've looked at it already. It's known as the creation mandate, perhaps the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate. It's basically God's command to humanity when he creates them. It's a divine mandate to all humans to fill, to rule, and to subdue the earth. You see all those concepts throughout that text. And because we are God's image bearers, this is effectively a command for humans to fill the earth with God's glory. Notice also that this, as we've discussed, this passage has some very practical elements to it. As we've discussed, there's implications of farming and agriculture and animal husbandry implicit in this mandate. Yeah, there's implications of some very practical tasks in this mandate. So what this means is that if a group of settlers, for example, were to set up a village or cultivate a field, then they wouldn't just be surviving, they just wouldn't be doing what they do. They would actually be glorifying God in what they do, glorifying God in their work. And that is because they are a group of God's image bearers, using God's creation to do what God commanded them to do. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that all territorial expansion is a good thing, nor is it a carte blanche for humans to do what they want with the environment as they see fit. There are, obvious caveats, and this has been abused throughout history. But what it does mean is that these tasks are, in their proper theological context, a good thing that glorifies God. We see also that this divine mandate is still in force after the fall, because it was reiterated to Noah in much the same language. So too, our status as God's image bearers is also reiterated to Noah. In fact, such is the continuity of this mandate that many theologians actually believe it's sort of cognate with the Great Commission. It's a different iteration of the same charge to humankind. But whatever you think about that, certainly both mandates are still in force. Matthew 28 and Genesis 1. So what this means is that all of our work, whatever it is that we do, all of our work should be seen as fulfillment of one of these two divine mandates, the Dominion Mandate and the Great Commission. So what this means is that all honourable vocations, so I'm sort of excluding professional drug dealers and sort of skipping over lots of ethical issues here. All honourable vocations are part of God's plan to fill the earth with this glory, with his glory. So that applies to all of us. For example, engineers are glorifying God when they use his creation to subdue the earth, when they build bridges and roads and so on, and iPhones, whatever. Accountants, likewise, helping families to steward their money wisely. Mums, also, importantly, raising up the next generation of, mums and dads, raising up the next generation of God's image bearers who will go out and fill the earth and make disciples. Retired people, especially so-called retired people, are not called to full-time leisure as today's advertising would have you believe, but rather called to active roles in ministry and prayer and whatever vocation God has given you. Hospitality workers are not excluded from this because they help people enjoy God's creation as it was intended to be enjoyed. So I encourage all of you, whatever it is that you're doing, whatever your work is, don't think about it as just a job. Don't think about it as just something you're doing for now to get some money to keep yourself ticking over. But rather, think about how it fulfills God's divine mandate. Either one of these two. Think about the unique way in which what you do glorifies God. And then perhaps when you've thought about that, share it with other people. Learn how what they do is uniquely glorifies God, uniquely fulfills his mandate to fill and subdue creation. So work is a blessing, work is a rest is a blessing, and work is a divine mandate. So if I were to summarize each of these 3 points with one verse or two verses, it would be from Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you'll receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ.